Hi everybody, here's your video clip on homeostasis. We started this concept in lecture the other day. We talked about the fact that this is a life or death situation for cells and for, in the case of multicellular organisms that contain many cells, the life of the entire individual is at stake when we talk about the term homeostasis. Homeostasis refers to the capacity of the body to maintain relatively stable internal conditions despite changes in the outside environment. Now, within a given cell, this has to occur as well. The conditions within the cell have to remain within a certain range in terms of temperature and pH, how acidic or basic the intracellular environment is within the cell. Or else, cellular processes grind to a halt. Everything stops and the cell dies. For instance, one reason that can happen is if enzymes, which are usually made of proteins, start to lose their three-dimensional conformation, lose their shape, they also lose their function. Then the cellular reactions cannot be facilitated in the way that they should, and the cell will die. Okay, so homeostasis refers to this capacity of cells and entire individuals to maintain a relatively stable internal environment that's compatible with life. Cells work really hard to maintain homeostasis, and the fact that the plasma membrane, the outer boundary of the cell, is selectively permeable helps a lot to try to keep the inside and the internal environment within the cell within a certain range of conditions. So the plasma membrane of the cell acts as a gatekeeper to try to control what comes across the plasma membrane into the cell and also what leaves the cell. There are, however, limits to what the plasma membrane can control in terms of what comes in and out of the cell. There are some substances, including water, that can move through the plasma membrane freely by a process known as diffusion. Diffusion just refers to the passive motion of molecules. It means no energy needs to be put into the system, and a substance will spontaneously, naturally go from where it's most concentrated to where it's less concentrated. We call that moving down its concentration gradient. So a substance will go from where it's high in concentration and will flow sort of downhill to where it's less concentrated. You can see this happen if you drop food coloring into a beaker of water. The molecules start out really concentrated right where you put the drop, and then if you let that water and food coloring sit there for a while, the molecules, which are constantly in motion, air molecules, water molecules are constantly in motion, they're constantly jiggling, and as that constant motion occurs, these dye molecules, the food coloring molecules, will spread out. They'll go from an area of high concentration to an area of lower concentration. They'll spread themselves out throughout the water until everything looks uniform. They diffuse from an area where they're highly concentrated to areas where they're less concentrated. That's the process of diffusion. And there are two vocabulary terms I'll introduce you to for the concept of diffusion. The solvent is the dissolving agent. In this case, in our example here, the water is the solvent. Water we've talked about as the universal solvent. It's such a good dissolving agent. The solute is the substance that gets dissolved in the solvent. Okay? So diffusion occurs without any energy being put into the system. And the substance that is being dissolved will go from an area of high concentration to an area where it's less concentrated. Now, the movement of water across the plasma membrane occurs by diffusion. You don't need to put energy into the system in order for water to change sides of the plasma membrane. And this is so important for the life or death of cells that it has, as your book points out, a fancy name all of its own. It's called osmosis. So osmosis refers to the diffusion of water through a selectively permeable membrane. Okay? And in the case of cells, we can talk about three different situations. We'll look at red blood cells as an example of what occurs when water moves down its own concentration gradient from where water is most concentrated to where water is less concentrated, and the water is switching sides of the plasma membrane. And as you're going to see, that has dire consequences for what happens to cells like red blood cells, which are responsible for carrying blood gases throughout the body, both water and carbon dioxide to all of the tissues of the body. So when red blood cells, which usually look, they're actually biconcave disc in the center, they're a bit depressed, they sometimes look kind of like donuts, not because they have a hole in them, but because they have a bit of a dip in the center. But we'll simplify and draw them as circles. So if this is a red blood cell, we're going to put this red blood cell in 3 different types of solution and see how the concentration of water affects the shape of this cell, okay? So if this red blood cell is placed in a solution that we call isotonic, what that means is that the amount of, the concentration of water on the inside of the cell and the outside of the cell is the same, okay? So we have some solutes dissolved in both the intracellular and extracellular environments. We'll draw the solute particles as X's for simplicity. Let's say there are we'll draw a total of 4 dissolved particles on the inside of the cell. And in this type of solution, isotonic will also draw 4 on the outside. That means the concentration of the solute, the dissolved substance, is the same on the inside and the outside of the cell. Therefore, there's just as much concentration of water on the inside and the outside of the cell. There's just as much space for water on the inside and the outside of the cell. So water will diffuse. It will still change sides of the membrane, the plasma membrane, but there won't be any net directional change in the amount of water in the cell. The cell will not change shape because some water molecules will diffuse in and some will diffuse out, but the rates of those 2 occurrences will be the same. So the cell will not change shape. The cell is safe in what we call an isotonic solution. So osmosis is occurring. That just means the movement of water through a selectively permeable membrane. Osmosis is occurring, but the same amount of water is going in and out, so the cell is safe. It does not change shape. That's an isotonic solution. Now let's look at what happens when a cell is placed in what we call a hypertonic solution. In a hypertonic solution, I look at the prefix hyper and think hyperactive. Well, on the outside of this kind of cell, there are lots more solute dissolved substances than on the inside of the cell, okay? Hypertonic solution means lots of dissolved solutes in the extracellular fluid outside of the cell. That means you can think of these as crowding out space for water. There's less space for water in this extracellular fluid. There's more water on the inside of the cell. Water is more concentrated inside than outside the cell, so water will flow down its own concentration gradient from the area where it's most concentrated to where it's less concentrated. Water will flood out of the cell. Water will leave the cell just flowing down its own concentration gradient. What will happen to the shape of the cell is the cell will shrink or crenate, okay? Not good. It's not good for a cell to shrivel up like that, okay? Now, the final scenario is what we call a hypotonic solution. So if this red blood cell is placed in what we call a hypotonic solution, if the prefix hyper refers to above, hypo tends to mean below or beneath. So in this case, a hypotonic solution, there are fewer solute or dissolved particles in the extracellular environment and more dissolved particles on the inside of the cell. This means there is more room for water on the outside and less room for water molecules on the inside of the cell. Water will flow down its own concentration gradient by the process known as osmosis. Water will enter the cell, and the cell will expand, expand, expand. It will swell and swell until eventually the cell is in danger of popping. That's what we call lysing, cell lysis. And then the cell dies. The cell cannot recover from that. That's also very bad. Okay, so that points out the importance of the fact that the plasma membrane does the best it can to maintain homeostasis and keep the internal conditions within the cell as stable as possible. But there are limitations. Water can diffuse through the plasma membrane by a process known as osmosis. The cell can't do anything about that. And in the case of red blood cells, for instance, this can cause the cell not only serious problems, but it can cause the cell to die if the external environment changes so quickly that the cell cannot compensate in any way, and the cell is in danger of dying. Okay, on to the next clip.